You ever have this problem when you're driving, especially at high speeds? You attempt to brake and the steering wheel starts to vibrate? If that happens to your car, then you need to change the rotors for the front two wheels. In this video, I'm going to show you how I changed the front side rotors on my 1998 Honda Accord. But before I start, let's look at why rotors warp. Say you're cruising down the highway at a nice speed and you see some cattle crossing the road. So you try to brake hard. You decide to go down a different road. Think to yourself, this road is so much better. But then you see some penguins crossing the road, so you brake hard again. All that braking is wearing down your brake pads and heating up your rotors. In fact, they get really hot. The more braking you do, the hotter your rotors will get. But once you stop driving your car, the rotors will cool down again. So let's review. To stop a car, brakes are applied to the rotors. All that braking power causes the rotors to get very hot. Heat causes metal to expand at the molecular level, and when braking power is not applied to the rotors or when your car is parked, they cool down. When metal cools down, the rotors contract at the molecular level. After years of expansion and contraction, metal tends to warp. Rotors on my car were not replaced for 15 years. That's a lot of driving, and as a result, the rotors have warped. But rotor change is cheap and easy. Two rotors only cost me $65. Mechanics tend to charge about $300 for this for parts and labor, so you save a lot of money doing it yourself. On top of that, it only took me about an hour to do the whole replacement. Okay, enough science for today. Alright, the tools you're gonna need to do this operation are a car jack, a tire iron, you're gonna need a medium-sized ratchet, a 17mm socket, a 15mm socket, a 13mm socket. We're also going to use two size 8 by 1¼ millimeter bolts to take the rotor out from its housing. And my secret weapon is going to be a tube that we're going to use for leverage. We're also going to need an 11-inch Phillips head screwdriver. First thing to do is to jack up the car and remove the front left wheel. After you remove the tire, you'll see the rotor, but before we can get it out, there are 4 bolts that we need to remove. These 4 bolts hold the brake caliper in place, so if you look behind the rotor, you're going to need to remove these 2 bolts right here, and you're also going to need to remove the bottom bolts right here. Use the 17mm nut to remove bolts 1 and 3, and the 15mm nut to remove bolts 2 and 4. Bolts 2 and 4 were not torqued too tight, so they were easy to remove, but we're going to use our secret weapon to remove bolts 1 and 3. Here I'm about to remove bolt number 3. Without the tube, it's tough to torque the bolts out, but it's easy when you use the tube for leverage. Simply place the ratchet inside the tube with the nut located on the bolt head and just torque. So once we got bolt number 3 out, we can start work on bolt number 1. And just do the same thing. Place the ratchet inside the tube and torque. Of course, if you have an air gun, it's much easier, but I don't have one of those. You can still get this job done without an air gun and just using a tube. Now that you removed all 4 bolts, the brake caliper easily comes off. Now that we got the caliper out of the way, we need to remove 2 screws holding the rotor in place. After you remove the screws, you could bang out the rotor with a hammer, but instead, we'll use the 2 size 8 by 1¼ millimeter screws to remove the rotor. All we need to do now is to insert the screws into the pre-drilled holes specifically made to remove the rotors. Once we got both screws in there, all we need to do now is tighten them with the 13mm nut, and the rotor should pop out easily. Tighten the screw in until you feel the rotor separating from its housing. Then move on to the next screw and tighten that in. At this point, the rotor has separated from its housing and can easily be removed. Now we're ready to install the new rotor. All we need to do now is just match up the holes for the screws that hold the rotor in place. A word of caution though, stay away from the drilled rotors because they tend to crack. Stick with the solid ones instead. So at this point, all we need to do now is just put the screws back in. After the screws, we need to install the bracket that is held in place by bolts 1 and 3. Once we tighten down the bracket, then we need to put the brake pads back in, the back one and the front one. They're very simple to install. After the brake pads, all we gotta do now is put the brake caliper back on and tighten that down with bolts 2 and 4. Once we tighten down all the bolts, we are pretty much done and we just stick the tire back on. This seems like a daunting task, but it's really not. It's one of the easiest fixes on your car, but you just have to be careful, that's all.